That is how we create opportunities in society. And then as they move.
Welcome to the Ink Tank, where we explore the impacts of leading edge technology on business and society.
Hi, this is David Yang. Welcome to the Ink Tank. I'm here with Amy Liu, Vice President and Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, David.
Let's start out with you sharing a little bit about your background and the focus of your work with Brookings.
When I was in college, I became really passionate about cities and helping the most vulnerable in our society. And I'm really grateful that my career has allowed me to work on both of those passions. And 20 years ago, I came to Brookings to help launch a new think tank on cities. And we did so because at the time, urban policy was considered dead, and most folks had a very negative view about the future of our cities. I'm really heartened that today that perception has changed. In fact, cities are considered sort of the epicenters of progress and the hearts of our democracy. And our work at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program today is to arm our leaders with data insights about the economic, social, and physical future of their communities. We partner with cities around the country to co-create solutions, and we make sure that federal and state policies are really responsive to the realities on the ground. At the end of the day, we believe that every single city and metropolitan area ought to be a beacon of growth and opportunity. What's really hard for me today is that given the events of the last week and the social unrest across the country about the continued racial injustices in society, we clearly have a lot more work to do in our cities.
To say that cities have experienced some dramatic upheaval this year would be an understatement. Let's start with the COVID pandemic. As cities begin to slowly reopen, what are some of the policies you're seeing put in place to address things like social distancing or maximum occupancy requirements or staggered commutes and such?
I want to start by just reiterating the scale of the economic challenge that our cities now face under the pandemic. Nationally, we have seen, 40 million people now have claimed unemployment insurance. We have looked at the fact that nearly 50% of small businesses across our cities and metropolitan areas are now at risk of permanent closure. And we know that the COVID-19 has exposed the racial disparities in our communities. And so a lot of the reopening and responses or the emergency responses we've seen in cities are trying to tackle all of those things, big seismic things at the same time. So, for instance, enormous amount of efforts to plug in where the federal government hasn't been able to when it comes to small business assistance, including making sure that all of our neighborhood restaurants and other small enterprises have access to resources to have them update their establishments for the new COVID reality, including the social distancing measures that you just talked about to meet CDC guidelines. I've also seen a lot of city and regional leaders step up using the online platforms to provide online workforce training, resume building, even more clarity about what job openings are available so that we can quickly connect unemployed persons to new opportunities if they wanted. Some of the cities have actually repurposed their existing dollars to help the unemployed move immediately into public sector health jobs or jobs needed in the pandemic. Instead of just searching for volunteers for emergency food assistance for families who can't do that, that we can give them a modest income for helping out in the community at this time.
Some scholars believe that this crisis could actually decentralize the population from cities. Do you think this is likely to happen? And what would be some of the lasting effects on society if we saw a move away from the cities?
I think our cities are going to continue to be centers of dynamism, innovation, and global economic growth. That's not going to go away. And in fact, I think the density of opportunities in our cities is the reason why we have a density of healthcare services, businesses that want to be where demand exists, young people who want to see where there's a density of opportunity. I think those factors are not going to go away. What I do see what's happening now is perhaps the superstar cities of our economy, the big global innovation centers on the coasts are starting to, whether it's New York or perhaps the Bay Area, are starting to see perhaps, particularly with Facebook and others announcing permanent telework, that there may be a small portion of the workforce that is going to leave the largest cities, the overheated markets, to more mid-sized communities around the country. And in fact, if even 10% of workers in these big major superstar cities decide to work in other locations, that's actually good for the economy because a lot of our heartland cities have actually been struggling to have access to some of those innovation workers.
In the last episode of Ink Tank, we actually talked about the rollout of 5G, and we mentioned the digital divide, which a lot of people think is an urban rural divide. But I believe the same challenges exist in the city when it comes to connectivity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I think that we're seeing all of our public school districts in our cities and suburbs grappling with this right now. I think nationally, about 14% of our school age children are in households that do not have a broadband subscription. And what we're hearing too is a lot of Black and Hispanic households, if even if they had broad access to broadband, most of their connectivity is through mobile connections, which is even harder to access some of the learning tools and online learning that is really needed for kids today. So this is an urban challenge. It is a suburban challenge, and I think a lot of our public private sector leaders are really trying to step up to close that digital gap.
Have you seen certain technologies such as thermal cameras or other sort of data analytics or tracking tools come into play in some of these early reopenings?
I am seeing certainly an uptake in all kinds of technologies that are being used today. And I want to probably use this moment to make a larger point. During a recession, in general, workplaces accelerate automation. And we're seeing now much more touchless technology being used. We're going to continue to see increased automation in our workplaces. And so, as we think about the opportunities that come with new technologies being adopted in this reopening and recovery phase, is we're going to have to think about what that does to workers who are most vulnerable to those kind of job automations. These are mostly in some parts of logistics, retail workers, food service, and we're going to have to quickly find ways to use those new technologies to prepare workers for where there is increased opportunity.
What can city leaders do to ease some of that economic transition?
One of the things that I'm a big believer of right now when we think about how our city is going to change is that, at least in the wake of COVID, is it's going to accelerate certain existing trends. And one of those trends it's going to accelerate is that the digital rich is going to get even richer. That the new technologies, for all of its promise, if left agnostic, is going to widen inequality. And the pandemic is likely going to accelerate that trend in our society unless we're more deliberate. And what do I mean by that? Prior to COVID, 90% of all the innovation jobs in society took place in just 5 metropolitan areas in the country: San Jose, San Francisco, San Diego, Boston, and Seattle. That meant the rest of the country, mid sized cities, small cities in the middle of the country, even if they were adding new tech jobs, were holding ground or barely keeping up. And so we are seeing geographic divide in our country. And so part of what we need to do post COVID is make sure that mid-sized cities in the middle of the country have extra resources as part of the recovery because they're going to have an even harder time catching up compared to places like New York and Seattle that are probably going to do fine after this. The other thing we saw before COVID was that all the new job opportunities were in IT and computer science or digitally related fields, is that most of the people who are working in those occupations were not our Black and Latino workers, that they were often left out of these digital pathways. And so, one of the opportunities I see is to use the COVID moment to help our young graduates of community colleges or colleges who are already majority people of color and our adults gain new skills in basic computer literacy, basic IT, offer them opportunities in the growing parts of our economy. I think one of the things we're seeing right now is that the folks who can work at home, the folks who can telework, the folks in office and business services jobs are doing fine. And in fact, they're hiring. And there's enormous opportunities to help a lot of the new generation of workers have access to these growth parts of our economy.
Some of those cities you mentioned that were experiencing the highest concentration of growth are also home to some of the big companies we're all familiar with, like Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. Have you all at Brookings looked into some of the policies they've put in place to help address job growth and training programs for people from disaffected communities?
Well, I think there are some very positive efforts underway. And one of the things I would argue first and foremost is that the way employers should step out in this moment to really expand digital inclusion or create economic inclusion in this digital economy is not to just throw money at it, to treat it as charity. And there's no doubt in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and other racial injustices, there's enormous amount of philanthropy going on right now in ways that I think is really helpful. But we need private sector companies to do more. Prior to the pandemic, Salesforce really stepped up not only in their investments in affordable housing, but in their second largest headquarters, which is presence, which is in central Indiana, they invested in a major apprenticeship program to ensure that local workers have access to the job opportunities their presence was going to create. I think LinkedIn, as part of the post pandemic crisis, has been using their platform to provide more online learning for people as they're looking for job transitions. And partnering with others to make that available, I think, is really important. But overall, I think that I see big tech, I see large corporations um, really thinking hard about their commitment to a more just and equitable society. And if they can do that through their hiring practices, through their procurement, and through their partnerships, I think we're going to see really important progress.
What role does education play in all of this?
When I think about workforce and education, I think workforce right now needs to step up in providing career coaches to people who are unemployed. One of the things that we've observed in a lot of our states and cities is we have 40 million people sign up for unemployment insurance. And when they do, they're not connected to any workforce training job opportunities. In fact, everyone should be attached or assigned a career coach at that moment if they wanted one. And the job of educators, whether it's K through 12, community college, or four-year institutions, is to provide the training and credentials that our employers need. I had the benefit of working with our partners in San Diego, and San Diego is a community that is trending towards being majority Hispanic. It is a border region, right? Where for all of its great startup entrepreneurship community and innovation sectors, and particularly in life sciences, is that the neighborhoods that border literally the Mexican US border are left out of that innovation economy. So I sat next to an executive of a defense contractor who wants to diversify its workforce and spent most of its life recruiting from four-year institutions. Never even dawned on them to partner with a community college as a source of their entry level workforce. And this past year, for the first time, they hired 40 young graduates of community college, many of them first time college goers and immigrants, and gave them job opportunities in entry level IT positions. And at the same time, because this defense contractor knows that in order for those 40 young people to stay in their company, they do eventually need additional training and a four-year degree. So they committed to help these 40 young people finish their college education and get a BA. And I think that partnership between a community college and employer is the future because our cities are going to be multiracial and multi-ethnic. And this next generation of people that are going to power our innovation economy, power our next gen products and services are going to come from the Black and Brown and immigrant communities of our society. And I think it's a great way for us to really invest in their future and therefore invest in us.
There's actually, as you know, a labor shortage for high demand IT jobs like the ones you mentioned. I was wondering if the companies you've partnered with are starting to see positive results in terms of hiring from more diverse labor pools.
One of the things I really want to see is just continued commitments by private sector employers to diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, and creating workplaces that not only diversify their workforce, but also have diversify their boards and create a culture of professional development so that a person of color could actually move into higher levels of leadership in their organization. That is how we create opportunities in society. And then as they move out of entry level positions, someone else can take their place. And we are seeing a lot more employers beginning to create those partnerships to diversify their workplaces. Brookings just last week held a webinar, a public event on fair chance hiring. And it included one person with a former criminal record and two employers that have changed their practices to accommodate new workers that have past records. It was one of the most uplifting conversations I've been part of, where a background check IT sort of company took someone who was previously incarcerated, gave them 3 months of IT training, and that person has already gone through three promotions and done really well in their organization. And so I do think that we need to be very open minded and respectful about all kinds of how we view talent today and give everyone the same equal tools to succeed in our companies or nonprofits.
I wanted to go back to COVID real quick. What are some of the innovations being put in place now in metropolitan areas to prepare for either a new wave of COVID or to plan for the next pandemic?
One of the things that this pandemic has exposed is that we have so disinvested in public health. And yet, at the same time, every single city and metropolitan area has a medical center, a medical university that is a bedrock employer, right? And so, what we really are starting to see is how do we create the new technologies to strengthen medical research around public health, how we make sure that our public health solutions reach all neighborhoods in our communities, and that we use contact tracing and other jobs being available from increased demand in public health as affirmative hiring opportunities for people who may be currently dislocated from them. So anyway, I see a mix of new technologies, new research investments, and new workforce investments in public health at this time.
So, as you know, we live in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and so much of the downtown here is driven by office spaces, their workers, and the businesses that support them. As we move more towards remote work, what is the ripple effect?
Well, first, I think that we're going to see a real shakeup in the real estate sector. And I'm sure those are things you have explored. I don't know what the future of the office sector and the office building is going to look like. I do think telework is going to be a major part of our future of work, and that's going to shape and change our physical form. Where we already are seeing huge vacancies in a lot of the office market and commercial real estate market in cities around the country. And I think those buildings are going to have to be repurposed. I think what's also interesting here is a lot of our downtowns and commercial corridors were dependent on workers to show up in these offices and then spill out to grab lunch or run errands. And all of those small businesses and restaurants that were hoping for 24/7 foot traffic may see just reduced demand around those commercial office and commercial corridors, at least for the next 18 months. And that's going to really stretch and stress those small businesses and their ability to survive. I think we're going to see enormous vacant commercial corridors in some of our neighborhoods, in some of our suburbs across the country. And we will need to rethink all of that
Mm.
as part of our future. The food sector has radically changed. And even in COVID, people have wanted to order home delivery. They still want to go to the grocery store. Grocery workers have been considered essential workers. In fact, what has happened in the last couple of decades is that over half of people's household food budgets come from food they purchase outside the home and not cooking in. And I do think that the future of the commercial corridor retail space is going to have more food, more prepared food mixed with shopping, because I think people are looking for that third space, that ability to access those resources as part of our urban footprint going forward.
So I saw a news report on Sunday around cities like San Antonio, Las Vegas, and Miami that focus on conventions. And as you know, they've taken a huge hit. Do you see them coming back one day?
There are certain cities that are going to be disproportionately impacted by COVID and perhaps for the long term. And those are cities highly dependent on tourism, highly dependent on hospitality, and highly dependent on even the convention business. And frankly, the convention business is highly concentrated now only in two markets, which is Orlando and Las Vegas, which also ties to their tourism sector. Those communities are under enormous amount of pressure to continue to diversify their economies in case that industry is suppressed for the long term.
I'd like to pivot and discuss some of the positives that you might see coming from all of this change. How could tackling some of these issues around COVID or social injustice enable a broader and more inclusive approach to urban economic development?
Before all the social unrest in the last couple of weeks, the conversations I have had with philanthropy, with mayors' offices, with businesses, civic leaders, is a real recognition that economic recovery from the pandemic must not return to normal, despite how we all miss normal. As we think about small business recovery, Black and Latino and immigrant entrepreneurs have actually been the ones to drive recovery. And even
Mm.
though they may have sustained the biggest losses during the last couple months, is how do we create a system that gives them the capital, the technical assistance, the networks for them to come back with either new product ideas or reopening their economy so that they are one of the first to bounce back. That system of supporting a more inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem is really fragile, even though every single city has been working on that. And the third is we do need to continue to think about ending segregation and neighborhood segregation in our communities. When we don't invest in commercial corridors or opportunities in some of the have not parts of our cities, is we disinvest in the wealth creation potential of a lot of those households. A lot of the economic recovery right now on jobs, on employment, on place redevelopment is all trying to challenge how we do this in a way that really benefits everyone in society. And I do think that is the opportunity. And I think I'm really encouraged by even the latest call to action from all the unrests across the country, large cities and small, that this might be a change moment to make that a reality and that vision a reality.
Personally, I'm trying to support local businesses, and sometimes it costs more and requires me to go out of my way, and they're often less convenient than going to a big box store. What do you think the willingness will be to pay higher prices in order to support local businesses?
In some cities, there's definitely a shift away from big box retail. And we're seeing already the Foot Lockers, the Pier 1 imports, these large chains are all shuttering right now, in part because of the rise of online shopping, the changing consumer preferences, and now the pandemic. And I think what we're seeing now is for those shoppers who have resources, there is a real demand for locally sourced, locally grown, more customized products. And I think those are the ones, when mixed in with really great foot traffic and other services, are going to survive. And so I hope that you and others continue to support local businesses going forward.
So, last question, two parts. Putting on your crystal ball, what does the average American city look like a year from now? And the follow up to that question is, how do we balance economic growth and stability with a resilient government?
So I do think there is a change in the mood in the country right now, that the American dream and the American ideal needs to be re embraced. And that is that We are a multiracial and multi-ethnic society. And already the young people in our cities are majority not white. And they're entering the workplace right now with enormous amount of fragility. I think that the future city is going to make the city work for them, that they will feel accepted, that they will feel safe, and that they will feel agency, that they can start the next company, that they can come up with the next idea, that they can lead another large firm. And I think the future city is going to give them those tools and opportunities because our cities will not be vibrant without them.
Well, I think our time is up. On behalf of all of the Ink Tank, I want to thank you for taking the time to come visit with us today. We'll be looking forward to the research that Liu of Brookings will be putting together to help shape the cities of the future.
Subscribe to The Ink Tank at theinktank.org or wherever you get your podcasts. The Ink Tank is brought to you by the University of Maryland's Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets and by Wake Forest University's Center for the Study of Capitalism.